One flight left before dawn. One old man who couldn't afford to miss it, and one girl running through a crowd of strangers, refusing to let him give up. She begged the woman behind the counter for one more seat. Just one. But the storm had taken everything, and the clock was already running out. He'd waited his whole life for this one morning. Then the board turned red, and every flight vanished. Around him, strangers watched an old man quietly lose hope. 5 people who'd never met. One phone, one map, one impossible idea. If they couldn't fly him there, maybe, just maybe, they could get him there another way. When every plane was grounded, they did the unthinkable. They drove straight into a storm nobody else dared to enter, all for a promise made to a man they just met. Dawn broke as they reached the door. His hand trembled on the handle. Somewhere inside she was waiting. Had they made it in time, or lost it by minutes? It started like the most ordinary morning. Nora, a 20-year-old college student, just trying to get home for the weekend. One small suitcase, one short flight, nothing complicated. Outside those big glass doors, the first few snowflakes were starting to fall. Light, pretty, harmless. That's what everyone figured. Nobody in that little terminal had the faintest idea what the next few hours were about to ask of them. It didn't take long for that pretty snow to turn mean. Within the hour, it was coming down sideways. And that little airport, filling up fast, delayed, then more delayed. You know that low, nervous hum a crowd makes when things start going wrong? That. Strollers, suitcases, people on phones with that tight, worried voice. Nora watched the board flip, one flight at a time, and told herself it'd clear up. It always does. Right? That's when she noticed him. An older man, maybe mid-70s, a few seats down. Tan cardigan, wire glasses, this gentle, worn face. He wasn't glued to his phone like everyone else. He was just holding something. A small photograph, edges soft from years of handling. He'd look at it, then up at the board, then back down at the photo. Over and over. And something about the way his hands trembled made Nora sit up a little straighter. Then it happened. The whole board went red at once. Not delayed anymore. Canceled. Every single flight. A groan rolled through the terminal, that collective sound of 100 ruined plans. People started lining up, arguing, sighing into their phones. But Nora wasn't watching them. She was watching the old man. Because the second that word lit up, something in his face just folded, like whatever he'd been holding on to had slipped right out of his hands. He didn't shout, didn't complain. He just sank back into his chair, the photo resting in his lap, and stared at nothing at all. And you know what? That was worse than any outburst. Nora had seen plenty of frustrated travelers. This wasn't that. This was a man quietly giving up on something that mattered. She sat there a second, telling herself it wasn't her business. Everyone's got somewhere to be. But she couldn't look away. So she got up. She sat down beside him and asked if he was okay. At first, nothing. Then, slowly, he turned the photo toward her. A young woman in a white dress, caught mid-laugh. His granddaughter. He'd raised her himself, he said, ever since her parents were gone. And tomorrow morning, at first light, she was getting married. He was the one meant to walk her down the aisle. There was no money for another ticket. This flight had been his only way. And now it was gone. Nora couldn't just let that sit. She walked straight to the service desk, the old man shuffling behind her. The woman working it, teal vest, tired eyes, looked like she'd been apologizing for hours. Nora laid it all out. The wedding, the dawn, the morning that couldn't wait. and she asked for anything. Any seat, any flight, any airport close enough to drive to. The agent just kept shaking her head. Nothing tonight. Everything's grounded. Maybe tomorrow. And tomorrow was already too late. That's when a stranger stepped in. A woman in a flight attendant's uniform, off the clock, coffee in hand. She'd heard the whole thing. She pulled Nora a few steps aside and pointed all the way down the terminal. "There's one flight," she said. "Different airline, far gate. Not canceled yet, but it's boarding right now." Nora looked at the old man, then back down that endless hallway. It was impossible. It was also the only chance left. For a second, the old man just stared at her, like he didn't dare believe it. Then Nora made the decision for both of them. She grabbed his worn leather bag, slung it over her shoulder, and reached for his hand. "Come on," she said. "We're not missing this." And something lit up in his eyes. That old spark, the one that had almost gone out an hour ago. He pushed himself up out of that chair, and they were moving. And then came the run. Full speed down that terminal, weaving through a crowd of strangers, the old man's worn leather bag clutched to her chest so he wouldn't have to carry it. People turned to stare. She didn't slow down for any of them. Somewhere at the far end, a gate was seconds from closing, and a man she'd met barely an hour ago was one shut door away from missing the most important morning of his life. 90 seconds. Maybe less. They made it to the gate. Barely. Chests heaving, legs burning. The old man a few steps behind, but still going. And for 1 second, it looked like they'd done it. The sign was right there. Their flight. Their one shot. But the gate agent was already turning away from the desk, already reaching for that little door. Nora threw up a hand. "Wait, please, just wait." The agent looked up, looked at the breathless girl, looked at the old man clutching his chest, that worn photo still in his fist. And you could see it on her face. She wanted to help, she really did. But she just shook her head, slow and sorry. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Boarding's closed." Closed. Such a small word. But it landed like a door slamming shut on the whole night. Nora's stomach dropped. This was supposed to be the moment they beat the storm, the moment it all worked out. Instead, they were standing at a gate that had already given up on them. And somewhere out on that runway, the last plane that could have gotten him there was going absolutely nowhere at all. And then it got worse. Because the agent glanced at her screen, frowned, and said the thing nobody wanted to hear. "Actually, it doesn't matter now. This one's grounded too. Just came through." Grounded. Every single flight. There was no last plane. There never had been. The whole desperate sprint, all of it, for a gate that was never going to open. Nora just stood there. The words weren't even sinking in right. She looked at the departure screen, and it was the same story everywhere. Red, red, red. The snow had won. She turned to look at the old man, and that was the hardest part, because he wasn't even upset anymore. He'd gone somewhere quiet. He just nodded slowly, like a man accepting something he'd been dreading all along. "It's all right," he said softly. "You tried. That's more than anyone else did." But it wasn't all right. Nora knew exactly what tomorrow morning looked like now. A young woman in a white dress, waiting at the back of a room, looking for a face that wasn't going to come. An empty spot right where her grandfather was supposed to stand. No. Nora wasn't ready to let that happen. Not yet. The old man lowered himself onto a bench near the window. Slow, careful, like the fight had drained right out of him. He set the photo on his knee and just looked at it. Didn't say anything for a long moment. Then quietly, almost to himself, "She was 3 when she came to live with me. Did I tell you that?" Nora sat down beside him. 3 years old, little thing, scared of everything. He smiled, but it was a sad kind of smile. I promised her I'd always show up. Every recital, every birthday, every time she looked out into a crowd, I'd be there. He ran a thumb over the edge of the photo. 20 years. I never missed one. Not one. He went quiet again. Outside, the snow kept falling, thick and uncaring. "And now the one day that matters most," he said. "I'm going to be the empty chair." Nora felt something twist in her chest, because she could hear it. That's not a man complaining about a canceled flight. That's a man about to break a promise he'd kept for 20 years. And sitting there, on that cold airport bench, she made up her mind. She could not let this be how the story ended. Now, a few feet away, there was this man. Maybe mid-40s. Sharp charcoal coat, expensive watch. The kind of guy who'd been huffing and snapping at the gate agents all night. He'd been on his phone, loudly rearranging some meeting, clearly furious about the storm wrecking his own plans. And honestly, Nora had already written him off. Just another impatient traveler who only cared about himself. But somewhere in the middle of the old man's story, he'd gone quiet. He wasn't on his phone anymore. He was just listening, watching this old man stare at a photograph of a girl in a white dress. And something in that hard, annoyed face started to shift. He looked away, cleared his throat, pretended to check his watch. But Nora caught it. That flicker. The one people get when a stranger's story reaches in and grabs something they'd forgotten they had. He stood there a moment longer. Then he took a slow breath, like a man about to do something he'd probably regret. Then he walked over. "How far?" he asked, gruff, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "The wedding. How far is it exactly?" Nobody expected that. Least of all Nora. And that one question cracked the whole thing open, because it planted an idea. If they couldn't fly, maybe they didn't have to. Nora pulled out her phone, thumbs flying. The wedding was a few hours away by road. Not close, but not impossible either. Not if they left right now. She looked up, and the words just came out. "We drive." The old man blinked. "Drive? In this?" "People are stuck all over this airport with nowhere to go," Nora said, already on her feet. "But we've got somewhere to be. So we drive." She said it like it was simple. It wasn't. Out those windows, the storm was howling. Roads half buried. Anyone with any sense was staying put. But Nora had stopped listening to sense about an hour ago. The businessman rubbed his jaw, thinking it over. The old man looked from one of them to the other, hope and fear fighting it out on his face. And Nora felt that familiar thing rise up in her chest. That stubborn refusal to just stand there and let a good man lose the thing he loved most. It was reckless. Maybe a little crazy. But it was a plan. Now they just needed a car. And that turned out to be its own problem. Here's the thing about a storm like that. Every rental counter in the airport had a line 30 people deep and a sign that all said the same thing. No cars available. None. Nora went from desk to desk anyway, asking, pleading, getting the same tired sorry every time. She was about to lose hope all over again. And that's when a quiet voice spoke up behind her. I couldn't help overhearing. Nora turned. A young woman, maybe late 20s, a sleeping baby tucked against her shoulder, a diaper bag sliding off one arm. She looked exhausted, the way only a new mom in a delayed airport can. But she was holding out her phone. My husband booked a car through a different app, she said. Off-site lot, about 10 minutes away. We're not using it. Our flight got pushed to tomorrow anyway. She hesitated, glancing over at the old man. You should take it. Nora stared at her. Are you sure? The young mother looked at the photo in the old man's hands, at the girl in the white dress, and her tired eyes went soft. My dad walked me down the aisle 2 years ago, she said quietly. Best moment of my whole life. Go. Please. Let him have that. So now they had a car. Sort of. A car sitting in a lot 10 minutes away, in the middle of a blizzard, that somebody still had to actually drive through the worst night of the year. And that's a big ask. Nora could drive, sure. But those roads? In that storm? She felt her confidence wobble just looking out the window. That's when the businessman stepped forward. He held up a hand. I'll drive. Everyone looked at him. I grew up in Minnesota, he said, almost annoyed about it. Learned to drive on roads worse than this. If anyone's getting this man to that wedding in one piece, it's me. And just like that, the guy Nora had written off as selfish an hour ago was volunteering to risk his own neck for a stranger. He shrugged off his fancy coat, rolled up his sleeves, grabbed the rental confirmation off the young mother's phone. Well, he said, already heading for the doors. Storm's not getting any smaller. Let's move. The old man looked around at all of them. These people he'd never met before tonight, now scrambling to hand him back the morning he thought he'd lost. He couldn't even find the words. So he just nodded and followed. They found the lot, and they found the car, half buried under fresh snow. Deshawn cleared the windshield with his bare forearm, muttering the whole time. And here's where they had to make a hard call. Because you can't take everyone. The young mother looked down at the baby asleep on her shoulder, then out at that howling storm, and she knew. I can't bring her out in that, she said softly. But you take the car. Go. She pressed the keys into Deshawn's hand and stepped back. The flight attendant squeezed Nora's arm. I'll stay and keep working the desks. Anything opens up, you're the first to know. So it came down to 3. Deshawn, who'd drive. Nora, up front to help watch the road. And the old man, settled carefully into the back, buckled in like he was something precious. Because right now, he was. The other 2 stood there in the snow and watched, breath fogging as the doors shut. Complete strangers just a few hours ago. Now one little team, pouring everything they had into an old man's promise. Deshawn turned the key. The engine coughed, caught, held. He glanced in the mirror at the old man behind him. All right, he said. Let's go get you to that wedding. The first few miles weren't so bad. City streets, plows still running, other headlights around them. Nora, up in the front seat, even let herself breathe a little. Maybe this would be okay. Maybe they'd actually pull it off. And then they hit the highway. That's when the world just disappeared. The city lights fell away behind them, and ahead there was nothing but black road and white snow coming at the windshield like static on an old TV. The wind picked up, shoving the car sideways every few seconds. Deshawn's hands tightened on the wheel. Nobody was talking now. The wipers slapped back and forth, and still they could barely see 30 feet ahead. Nora watched the speedometer drop. 40, then 30, then 20. Slow, careful, crawling through a storm that clearly wanted them to turn back. In the back, the old man had gone quiet, his eyes fixed on the window, the photo cradled in his hands. And Nora did the math in her head. The wedding was at first light. They'd left later than she wanted. At this speed, in this weather, it was going to be close. Way too close. She just prayed the road ahead would give them a break. It didn't. It happened fast. 1 second they were crawling along, tense but steady. The next, the whole car just let go. They hit a patch of ice hidden under the snow, and the back end swung out like it had a mind of its own. Nora's stomach shot into her throat. She grabbed the dashboard. In the back, the old man braced a hand against the seat in front of him. And Deshawn, bless him, didn't panic. He eased off, turned into the slide, hands steady, jaw locked, whispering, "Come on, come on, come on," under his breath. For a few endless seconds, the car just floated. Sideways, headlights sweeping across a wall of white. Nobody breathed. Then the tires caught. The car straightened, and they rolled to a slow, shaking stop in the middle of an empty, snow-blind highway. Silence. Just the wipers, and 2 hearts pounding along with the drivers. Deshawn let out a long breath. "You two okay?" 2 shaky yeses. The old man, pale but calm, put a hand on Deshawn's shoulder. "Son," he said quietly, "maybe this is a sign. Maybe I'm asking too much of you both." And for the first time all night, Nora heard real doubt in his voice, like he was ready to tell them to just turn around. For a long moment, nobody said anything. The car just sat there, engine humming, headlights pointed at a wall of snow where the road used to be. Blocked. Completely. A fallen barrier, drifts piled higher than the hood. There was no going forward. Not this way. And Nora felt the whole thing start to slip through her fingers again. She pulled out her phone, screen glowing in the dark, and started searching for another route. Anything. A back road, a detour, a farmer's lane. She didn't care. The old man's voice came from the back, quiet and tired. "Maybe we should just turn around. I don't want anyone getting hurt over an old man's wedding." And that's when Deshawn spoke up, still gripping the wheel, eyes forward. "With respect, sir," he said, "I didn't drive through a blizzard to turn around 20 minutes short." Nora almost laughed, because he was right. They hadn't come all this way to quit at the last fence. She zoomed in on the map, tracing a thin gray line that curved around the blocked stretch. Longer, slower, but open. "There," she said, pointing. "We go around. It adds time, but it's clear." Deshawn looked at it, nodded once, and put the car in reverse. The tires spun, caught, and slowly they backed away from that wall of white and swung onto the detour. Nobody knew if it would work. The clock was still ticking toward first light. But they were moving again. And sometimes that's the only thing that matters. Not knowing you'll make it. Just refusing to stop trying. The detour was quieter. Slower roads, less wind, just the soft hum of tires on packed snow. And somewhere in that quiet, the old man started to talk. Not about the storm, not about the wedding, about her, his granddaughter. He told them how she used to fall asleep on his shoulder during old movies, how she cried the first time she rode a bike, then laughed the second, how she called him every Sunday, no matter what. Even when she was busy, even when she had every reason to forget. "She's the best thing I ever did," he said softly, turning the photo in the dim light. "And I raised her telling her one thing over and over. You show up for the people you love, no matter what." He went quiet. So how could I not show up for her? In the front seat, Nora felt her eyes sting. Because that was it, wasn't it? That was the whole reason a girl and a gruff businessman and a tired stranger were driving through the worst night of the year. Not obligation, not luck, just that simple, stubborn idea. You show up. Deshaun cleared his throat, eyes still on the road. "My dad used to say something like that," he said quietly. "Haven't thought about it in years." And just like that, the car full of strangers didn't feel so full of strangers anymore. They were three people bound together by one old man's promise, chasing a sunrise none of them was sure they'd beat. Nora looked out at the lightening sky, still dark, but not as dark as before. Dawn was coming. And so, maybe, were they. And then, slowly, the world started to change. The snow, which had hammered them for hours, began to ease. First to flurries, then to just a few lazy flakes drifting down. And ahead, low on the horizon, the sky started to glow. Soft gold, a little pink at the edges. Dawn. The old man leaned forward between the seats, staring at it like he couldn't quite believe it. "First light," he whispered. "The wedding's at first light." Nora checked the map. The town was close now, minutes away. But so was the ceremony. It was going to be right down to the wire. Deshaun pressed a little harder on the gas, careful but urgent, the tires humming over the last stretch of road. Nobody spoke. Everybody watched that skyline grow closer, rooftops and a little church steeple catching the very first rays of morning. And Nora realized her heart was pounding, not from fear this time, but from something closer to hope. They'd driven through a wall of snow, slid across black ice, backed away from a blocked road and found another way. 5 strangers had become a team, and a team had become something like family, all in the space of one impossible night. And now, as the sun cracked over the horizon and painted the snow gold, they were almost there. Almost. She glanced back at the old man, at the photo trembling in his hands, at the tears already gathering in his eyes. "We're close," she said softly. "Hold on. We're so close." They pulled up to the little chapel just as the bells began to ring. And for a second, the old man didn't move. He just sat there, staring at those doors, the photo clutched to his chest. Because getting there had been the whole fight. And now that they'd made it, a different kind of fear crept in. What if he was too late? What if she'd already given up on him, already started without him, already decided the empty chair was just how it was going to be? Nora opened his door and offered her hand. "Come on," she said gently. "You didn't come all this way to sit in the car." He looked at her. This girl who'd been a total stranger the night before, who'd refused to let him quit, who dragged an entire team through a blizzard for a man she barely knew, and his eyes filled up. "Why?" he asked, voice cracking. "Why would you do all this for me?" Nora just smiled. "Because you were going to show up for her," she said. "So we showed up for you." Deshaun came around and took his other arm. Together, slow and careful over the snow, they walked him up the path toward those big wooden doors. The old man's legs were shaking, not from the cold, from everything. 20 years of Sundays, 20 years of showing up, all of it leading to this one morning, this one door. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and took a breath. "All right," he said. mostly to himself. All right. And he reached for the handle. His hand rested on the handle. Just rested there, trembling. Nora stood beside him, holding her breath. Deshawn on the other side, doing the same. Because they all understood what this moment was. This wasn't just a door. Behind it was everything he'd nearly lost. Everything they'd nearly failed to save. A whole night of impossible odds, all coming down to whether an old man could find the courage to push one door open. "You've got this," Nora whispered. He closed his eyes for a second. And maybe he was thinking about that 3-year-old who came to live with him all those years ago. Or the promise he'd made her. The one he'd kept through every recital and birthday and Sunday phone call. Or maybe he was just gathering the strength to walk through and find out if he'd made it in time. Then he opened his eyes, and he pushed. The door swung inward, and a warm light and soft music spilled out to meet them. Rows of people, flowers, a hush as heads began to turn. And at the far end of it all, at the back of the aisle in a white dress, a young woman was standing with her hand already reaching for the doors, about to walk in without him. She froze. Her eyes found the old man in the doorway. Snow on his shoulders, tears on his face, that worn photo still in his hand. And for one long, trembling second, the whole world seemed to stop. Nobody breathed. Not the old man. Not Nora. Not a single soul in that little chapel. And then she ran. The bride, in her white dress, down the whole length of that aisle, past every startled guest, and she threw her arms around the old man in the doorway. "Grandpa," she sobbed into his shoulder. You came. And he held her like he was never going to let go. "Of course I came," he whispered, his voice breaking on every word. "I promised you. I always show up. Always." The whole chapel was crying now. Guests dabbing their eyes, the minister smiling, everyone watching this old man and his granddaughter hold on to each other like the rest of the world had disappeared. From the doorway, Nora watched too. Tears streaming down her own face, Deshawn beside her looking suspiciously misty for a man who'd claimed he was just there to drive. The bride finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, and looked past her grandfather at the 2 exhausted strangers standing in the snow behind him. "Who?" she started. The old man turned and put a hand on Nora's shoulder. "These," he said, his voice thick, "are the people who got me here. Through the storm, all night, for a promise that wasn't even theirs to keep." The bride looked at them, at their tired faces and snow-dusted shoulders, and she didn't have words. She just reached out and pulled them both into the hug too. And there, in the doorway of a little chapel at dawn, 5 people who'd started that night as total strangers stood wrapped together, holding on. Because some promises, it turns out, aren't kept by one person. They're kept by whoever shows up. A few minutes later, the music started again. This time for real. And the old man, snow still melting on his shoulders, straightened his cardigan, offered his granddaughter his arm, and walked her down that aisle exactly the way he'd promised he would. Slow steps, proud steps, his hand shaking a little on hers, hers shaking a little on his. Every guest on their feet, every eye wet. And the old man walking taller than a man who'd been up all night has any right to walk. Because this was it. This was the moment he'd driven through a blizzard for. The moment he'd almost given up on. Twice, 3 times. The moment a girl in a red hoodie had refused to let slip away. From the back of the chapel, Nora watched them go, arm in arm toward the altar, and she felt something settle in her chest. That deep, quiet kind of happiness that doesn't come from anything working out easy. It comes from something almost not working out at all. Deshawn leaned over. "Worth a drive," he murmured. And Nora just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The old man reached the front, kissed his granddaughter's cheek, and gently placed her hand in the hand of the person waiting for her. Then he stepped back, into his seat, into the front row, into the chair that had so very nearly been empty. And as the ceremony began and the morning light poured gold across the whole chapel, Nora finally let out the breath she felt like she'd been holding since a snowy terminal, a lifetime ago. The ceremony was simple, beautiful, the kind of small-town wedding where everyone knows everyone, where the flowers are homegrown and the vows are handwritten, and there's not a dry eye in the building. And through all of it, the old man sat in the front row, exactly where he belonged, watching his granddaughter promise her life to someone she loved. He held that worn photograph in his lap the whole time, the one he'd stared at all night in a canceled airport, in a sliding car, on a blocked road. The little girl in it was all grown up now, standing at the altar in white. But to him, Nora suspected, she'd always be that 3-year-old who fell asleep on his shoulder. Somewhere near the back, 3 tired strangers stood watching, unable to leave, not yet. Nora, who'd started it all by simply refusing to look away. Deshawn, who'd driven through the kind of night most people would have slept through. And though they weren't there, Nora thought of the young mother who'd handed over her car without a second thought, and the flight attendant still working a desk somewhere, hoping. All of them, part of this now. Part of a morning that almost didn't happen. The minister said the words. The couple kissed. The whole chapel erupted, cheering, crying, clapping, and the old man rose to his feet with everyone else, clapping the hardest of all, tears rolling freely down his face. He'd made it. Against every odd, through every storm, he'd kept his promise. He'd shown up. And he wasn't the empty chair after all. Afterward, they stood outside in the sparkling morning snow, the 3 of them, not quite ready to say goodbye. The old man took Nora's hands in both of his. "I don't have the words," he said. "I've been trying to find them all morning, and I just don't." "You don't need them," Nora said, smiling. "Seeing that was thank you enough for a lifetime." He pulled her into a hug, the kind that means something, and held on. Then he shook Deshawn's hand, and when Deshawn tried to keep it businesslike, the old man just pulled him in too. "You're a good man," he told him. "Your father knew what he was talking about." Deshawn, tough Deshawn, had to look away for a second. They exchanged numbers, promised to keep in touch, the way people do after a night like that, except this time, everyone actually meant it. The bride and groom came out to thank them again. The old man's family surrounded them, hugging strangers, wiping eyes, insisting they stay for the breakfast. And standing there in the sun, watching this whole warm crowd of people who'd been nothing to each other 12 hours ago, Nora felt it fully. The thing she'd chased into a blizzard without even knowing why. It was never really about a flight, or a car, or a wedding. It was about what happens when one person decides not to look away. When one person says, "That stranger's promise matters, and I'm going to help him keep it." And how that one small choice can pull a whole group of people into something bigger than any of them. Nora didn't stay long after that. She'd started the night as a stranger just trying to get home. But somewhere along the way, home could wait a little longer. She slipped out into the bright, quiet morning. The storm was gone now, everything soft and white and glowing in the early sun. And she thought about how close it had come, how easy it would have been to just look away in that terminal. Most people would have. But she didn't. And because she didn't, an old man walked his granddaughter down the aisle. That's the thing about showing up, Nora thought. You never really know how far it goes. You just decide to do it. She smiled, pulled her hood up against the cold, and walked on into the bright new morning.